Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most compassionate. Today, Ikhwan and Akhawat, brothers and sisters, I want to discuss science and revelation. Now we have to be very clear from the beginning that science is not a yardstick for truth. Because if you look into the philosophy of science, we will see that the methodology of science doesn't produce truth, doesn't bring about truth, doesn't give us conclusive facts, because the nature of the scientific methodology is limited. It's contingent and dependent on a certain set of variables, such as time, for instance. So from the philosophy of science, we see that science itself, all it can give you is speculative results, or the results that are best according to the variables that we have, such as time, as we mentioned. So science is not a yardstick for truth. In the language of Islamic thought or Islamic philosophy, it would go under the category of ilm al-dhann, the knowledge of doubt, if you like, or the knowledge of speculation. So it would be highly absurd to use a speculative methodology to prove the absolute, to prove, for example, the Quran, or to prove Islam. It would be highly absurd to do that. Also, we have to understand that the perspective that science is the only method to give us truth is flawed. It is self-defeating. Now, this statement in itself, the claim that science is the only yardstick to give us truth, is what you would call scientism. And I would argue that scientism is flawed because it is self-defeating. For instance, the reason I'm saying it's self-defeating is because you can't prove that very statement using science. Because the statement of scientism is what? It says that science is the only way to truth. Science is the only method to establish truth. That statement itself cannot be proven using science, so it's self-defeating. Also, scientism is incoherent from that perspective because it cannot prove mathematical truths or logical truths, which are necessary in order for us to have science. For instance, 1 + 1 is equal to 2. These are logically necessary truths, and we need this logic before we have science. Now, for science to try and prove this logic, this mathematics, this necessary truth, is equivalent of arguing in a circle. So science can't even prove the very thing that is required for science to work, which is mathematics and logic. Also, we have to understand that scientism, which, just to remind you, is the claim that science is the only method for truth, or the only method to establish truth, is incoherent because it cannot prove like historical truths. Like, where was there things such as Nazi Germany in the 1940s? Can science actually prove that? No, it can't. Can it prove the 1066 invasion, or the Battle of Hastings, or the Norman invasion of England? Can it prove any of these things, these historical facts? No, it can't. It's outside of the domain of science. Also, a more humorous note, we have to understand that science can't really give us morality. Science tells us what is, but it can't tell us what ought to be. You can't get an ought from an is. For example, science tells us how the earth goes round the sun, but it doesn't tell us how human beings should behave, for instance. So it can't deal with moral paradigms or moral realities. Also, slightly even more humorous, science can't deal with our emotions. For example, imagine going to your wife and saying to your wife, "My darling, my love, I love you." And she responds, "Be quiet. This doesn't mean nothing. This is only chemicals in your brain." So to even try and justify psychological realities, all you can do is reduce them to things like carbon and molecules, essentially. So the point I'm trying to say here is this, that science is not the only way or the only method to establish truth or to establish facts. So this is very important, something that we have to understand before we get into the science and revelation discussion. So, when we look into revelation, we look into Quran, does it go against science? Now some may argue, yes, there are some things that go against today's understanding of science. Fair enough. But we believe the Quran to be from Allah because of its linguistic miracle and other miracles that it has, such as its historical miracle, etc. So from the perspective of science, maybe there's some parts of the Quran that goes against today's understanding of science because, as we said, science has a limited methodology, it's dependent on certain variables. What is true today may not be true tomorrow. What is fact today may not be fact tomorrow. And we've seen this. For example, we've seen this in cosmology. In the 1950s and 60s, we had the steady state theory of the universe, that the universe had no beginning, no end. But now we have more of a dynamic theory, which is like Big Bang cosmology, like the hot standard model, which basically is telling us there is a beginning to time, we have a spatio-temporal boundary. So science has changed. So the point I'm trying to say here is that when we look into the Quran, when it discusses scientific phenomena, we have to approach it not from the point of view of science, but the point of view of established fact. And established facts are different from science, are different from the outputs of science, are different from the outputs from the method of science, are different from scientific facts. Established facts would be these binary, observable realities. Is something black or is it white? Is it round or is it flat? These things that don't have the element of doubt and are not dependent on the variables that the scientific methodology is dependent upon. This is something that we have to be very clear about, very fundamentally clear about. There's a difference between scientific fact and a difference between natural phenomena or established facts. So when we look into the Quran, we have to see, are there any established facts that couldn't have been known in the 7th century Arabia? Are there any established facts that couldn't have been known in 7th century Arabia, but are known today because of, we know them via observation, rather than the speculative, limited understanding of the scientific method? And I think there are. And this what we can try and show, that the Quran is a miracle from the point of view that these established facts were not known in 7th century Arabia, but are known today as established facts, not based on scientific method, which is limited as we discussed, but it's based upon the observable binary realities. Is it 1 or is it 0? Is it black or is it white? Is it round or is it flat? And this we can show in the Quran in Surah Mu'minun, in chapter 23, verses 12 to 15, when it talks about the development of the human embryo. And in these verses, the Quran mentions key terms. For instance, it mentions nutfa, and we're going to discuss what these mean. It mentions nutfa, qararin makin, alaqa, mudgha, idam, lahma. So these key terms, we're going to find out what they mean in the classical Arabic dictionaries like Lisan al-Arab and academic dictionaries like Edward Lane's lexicon. And from these meanings, we're going to see if they correlate, if they match to established facts in the development of the human embryo, in the development of the human being. And what you're going to see some fascinating results. Now we're going to say, how could have anyone known this 1400 years ago? Because our level of observation wasn't good enough at that time. For example, we didn't have microscopes. And now our level of observation has changed, and we could see more established facts with regards to observation. So we're going to correlate these terms to modern embryology, modern developments in the development of the human embryo, and we're going to see how they correlate and match after the break. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of God, in the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. We were talking about science and that it is a limited methodology. We were talking about the incoherence of scientism, which basically asserts and says that science is the only method to establish truth. Science is the only way to find truth. And we discussed the incoherence of scientism. And also we discussed that there is a difference between scientific facts and established facts. Established facts are not dependent on the variables that science is dependent upon, such as time. Whereas established facts are quite unique. They're like observed realities. For instance, is something round or is it flat? Is it black or is it white? And what is very interesting, that when we go to Surah Mu'minun, the 23rd chapter of the Quran, verses 12 onwards, we see that it discusses an established fact with regards to the development of the human embryo that no one could have known in the 7th century. Because the 7th century, we didn't have the other addition, if you like, of an observed reality, another level of observation, which would require the microscope. Now we have that, we have different established facts. So when it comes to the reality of the development of the human embryo, we see that the Quran is in line with established modern facts, which we couldn't have known in the 7th century, which indicates that we can't have a naturalistic explanation. And this statement, these verses themselves about the development of the human embryo, the development of the human being, is a sign to the divine, because we can't find a natural explanation. Therefore, we have to look for supernatural explanations. So let's discuss the key terms. The first one is nutfa. According to the classical dictionaries like Lisan al-Arab and Edwin Lane's lexicon, which is an academic corpus, an 8-volume corpus, we have to understand that nutfa means a sperm drop. It is something from the semen. It is not the semen itself. And we see this in the Quran, when the Quran mentions nutfatin min maniyyin in chapter 75 of the Quran. It says the nutfa is from the mani, it's from the semen, it's from the liquid called semen. Also, we have to understand that the Quran mentions that the nutfa is a mixed substance. Also, when we look into the prophetic traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, it talks about that the nutfa is from the male and from the female. Significantly, in the Quran mentions that the nutfa is a sulala, it's an extract. The Arabic word sulala means extract, something specific, something extracted. So the nutfa is an extract from the liquid, referring here to the semen. So the Quran is saying is that it's an extract. It is, the prophet traditions are saying it's from the male and the female. The Quran is saying it's a mixed substance as well. The Quran is mentioning that it's from the semen. So we see there's a differentiation between nutfa and semen. That nutfa is from the semen, it's something extracted from within it, it's a mixed substance, and from the male and female. And remarkably, this is in line with modern developments in embryology in terms of the established facts that we can observe. And what we can observe is that essentially what happens at this stage is the process of fertilization. There is a nutfa from the male and a nutfa from the female. The nutfa from the male is a sperm which is contained in semen, and the nutfa of the female is the egg from a bigger group of its kind, a larger group of its kind, more eggs in the ovum, in the ovaries. And we have to understand that this egg is coated in follicular fluid, and according to Bruce Stanton, who is a modern physiologist, is coated in oviductal secretions. So you see here, there's a nutfa of the male, which is an extract, sperm contained in semen, and a nutfa of the female, which is an egg extracted from the ovaries. There are many other eggs in the ovaries, and is contained in liquid oviductal secretions or follicular fluid. And these two mix together. Remember what the Quran says? The nutfa is also mixed. They mix together to form the zygote. And this is the process of fertilization, exactly in line with what the Quran is saying. So from the nutfa we have the process qararin makin. Now qararin makin, essentially according to these classical and academic dictionaries, something fixed, something placed, something that is in a safe place. And you see this is in line with modern embryology, which is called what? It's called implantation. Now the 6th day after fertilization, an interesting process happens which is called implantation. Now from the zygote develops into a blastocyst, and the blastocyst essentially is the cells subdividing, and there is an outer wall or an outer shell. And the blastocyst, interestingly, sinks deeper and deeper in the endometrium, into the womb. And what happens, it is sealed off by a fibrin clot called the operculum, and it sinks deeper and deeper. And you can find this in the works of modern embryologists like John Allen and Beverly Kramer, Ram Sharma, and many others. You see that the process of fertilization is that the blastocyst sinks deeper and deeper, is covered by a fibrin clot. This is exactly what the Quran mentions, Qararin Makin, in a safe place to be firmly fixed. After this stage, the Qararin Makin stage, we have the stage of the alaqa. This is very interesting. Now alaqa, according to the classical dictionaries, according to Lisan al-Arab, according to Edwards Lang lexicon, has three main meanings. The first meaning is something that is suspended or hanging. The second meaning is a leech or worm, and the third is a blood clot or blood in general. Now each of these three meanings are in line with modern developments with regards to embryology, the established facts in embryology, the observable realities. Let's take the first one. Now what's very interesting is that when the blastocyst has been implanted, it starts to form the early stages of the embryo. Now the early stage of the embryo essentially is almost like a disc-like structure, and it is connected to a connecting stalk. Now this connecting stalk essentially suspends and hangs the embryo in the extraembryonic cilium. Now the extraembryonic cilium is this cavity, and this is exactly what happens. The connecting stalk hangs the embryo and suspends the embryo in the extraembryonic cilium. This is what John Allen and Beverly Kramer say in their book, The Fundamentals of Human Embryology. They essentially say the connecting stalk is there to hang and suspend the developing human embryo. This is exactly what the Quran says 1400 years ago, which we know the word alaqa also means to hang or suspend. Let's take the second meaning, which is a worm or a leech. Now this is exactly the observation of the human embryo. It looks like a worm or a leech. And the reason for that is because of two processes. These two processes are neurulation and the folding of the embryo. Now neurulation is when the neural folds, they close together in the embryo. And the folding of the embryo is when the head and tail come closer together. The combination of these two processes make the embryo look like a worm or a leech. This is why Dr. Dale Lehman, in his book, Anatomy Demystified, he says the embryo looks like a worm. Keith Moore, Professor Keith Moore, another embryologist, he says the embryo looks very leech-like. So we see it's in line with modern observable facts. The final meaning of the word alaqa is that it is a blood clot or something bloody, or blood in a general sense. And this is exactly what happens, because we see by the end of the third week, we see there is the development of the initial cardiovascular system. We have the primary heart developing, the initial stages of the heart developing, and the initial stages of the primary cardiovascular system. And what you see from an observational perspective is very red and bloody. But what's very interesting is that at this stage the blood is fluid, but it's not circulating. It starts to circulate at the end of the third week. And this is exactly what a blood clot is. There's some fluid in there, but it's not circulating. So you see all the three possible meanings of the word alaqa in line with established facts in modern embryology. So after alaqa, we have the term mudghah. Now mudghah essentially means something that has been chewed, mastication, to chew, or something that's left the imprint of teeth marks on. And this is exactly what happens in this subsequent stage. Because what happens is that you have somite formation. Now somites, they travel to the notochord, which is like almost the backbone of the developing embryo. And they develop sclerotomes. And these sclerotomes look like bite marks. They're all at the side of the embryo. It looks like someone's just chewed or bitten the embryo. So you see that mudghah, in terms of what it means, is in line with modern observations. From the word mudghah, we have idam. And idam essentially means bones, or specifically the bones of the hams and limbs upon which there is flesh, especially if you look into the works of Edward Lane's lexicon. So there's the development of the limb structure, and this is what happens. The initial stages of the skeletal framework are in place, which you can call the cartilaginous models of the bones, and they start to grow during the 5th, 6th and 7th week. From idam, then you have lahma. But before lahma, we have to make you realize that the Quran mentions fakasona. Now, fakasona means, and then we clothe. The word kasona means to drape, to inline, to cover, to aggregate, to cover. And fakasona is very interesting because the Quran says, fakasona, we clothe, idam, the bones, with lahma, flesh. Now, lahma, very interesting. This is exactly what happens. The lahma, which is flesh, is clothed over the bones. Now, if we go into the works of John Allen, Beverly Kramer, Ram Sharma, and many other modern embryologists, what they say is that the precursor cells to muscle formation, which are the myoblasts, they migrate distally. They move, they migrate distally and aggregate over the developing skeleton. This is exactly what fakasona means. And then we clothe, we aggregate, we drape, we aligned, we covered the flesh over the bones, in line with modern developments. Now, some people say, why does the Quran use the word lahma? It should use the Arabic word adlat, which means muscle, because it's more specific. But no, the Quran is very concise here. Because what happens at this stage, according to John Allen and Beverly Kramer, is not only muscles are developing and clothed, but also other connective tissue like tendons. And this is profound because in lahma, in meat, not only do you have muscle tissue, but you have tendons and other connective tissue. And this is why the Quran is so profound from this perspective. Other people also complain and say, look, we don't know what happens. We think bones and muscles are developed at the same time, but this is not true. They may be developed at the same time, but the Quran is not actually saying what develops at the same time. Because it says the bones are created, فَخَلَقْنَا, and then we created the bones, but it doesn't say when the muscles are created. All it says is فَكَسَوْنَا, and then we clothed. So the precursor cells for muscle and bone formation may occur simultaneously, but the process of clothing, the migration of the muscle cells, the myoblasts, when they're covering over the developing skeleton, happens after the creation of the initial skeletal framework. Something very specific we have to understand here. Also, some people claim, with regards to the alaka stage, that we're cheating a bit. We're saying that the alaka doesn't look like a worm or a leech because we're forgetting the yolk sac. The yolk sac is this sac that's underneath the embryo, and it is required for the initial stages of nutrition. Now, some people say the yolk sac is part of the embryo, so you're ignoring the whole embryo. But there's something specific we have to understand here. According to modern embryologists, first and foremost, the yolk sac is not part of the main structure of the embryo. This is why if you look at works of Bruce Carlson, you look at the works of Keith Moore and others, you see that they describe the relationship between the embryo and the yolk sac as two different distinct things, that they have a relationship with one another. This is why many embryologists, they say that the yolk sac is incorporated into the embryo, indicating it's not really part of the embryo. For example, it is required for the primordial gut. Now, the yolk sac, also known as the umbilical vesicle, is a separate entity. It's what you would call, in the words of the embryologist Bruce Carlson, an extra embryonic membrane or extra embryonic feature. However, even if you consider it as part of the embryo still looks like a leech or worm, but it looks like a leech or worm sucking on a sac. So we could do with some of these contentions. So from this perspective, Ikhwan and Akhawat, we've said that science itself is a limited study, it's not a yardstick for truth. We discussed that the claim that science is the only method required to establish truth is incoherent, and we discussed why. And then we went into Revelation to see, are there any realities in established natural phenomena and established facts that we can find in the Quran that you can't find in the 7th century? And yes, we can. It's the development of the human embryo, because we've just discovered recently, relatively recently, established facts with regards to the development of the human embryo, established observable realities, and we see that this is in the Quran. So how could the Quran be from a human being? Because the Quran was emerged in the 7th century, and they knew nothing about this. They adopted the Galenic and Aristotelian falsehoods of embryology, which had many mistakes, which is going to be a subject of another program as well. So, we know the Quran must have come from the divine, because we can't explain it from a 7th century understanding, because everything it says is correct and accurate with regards to modern established facts. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.